understand the sense in which ways for something to happen are supposed to be totally relevant to the thing that happens, and some tests that might help us identify ways in that sense. And that kind of relevance is important, not just in truth making, but in say reasons for believing a thing, reasons for doing a thing. It's important in causes of a thing and aesthetic grounds of a thing, all kinds of notions in that area. Evidential relevance in a very specific sense, where you're only including the evidence that is relevant and leaving out the stuff that doesn't matter. Anyway, so let's get started. Okay, so as I said, our main interest is in ways for us to be true, a sentence to be true, call those true ways or truth makers. There's three things that often get said, and I'm going to comment on all three, but most of our emphasis will be on the third. The first thing people say is that a truth maker for S should suffice for S, or suffice for the truth of S, which normally means necessarily if the truth maker holds, then S is true. That's sometimes called truth maker necessitarianism. The second is that a truth maker should account for S's truth. It should spell out how and why the sentence holds. That's often put it in the language of in virtue of. The sentence S should be true in virtue of the truth maker obtaining. I should say, by the way, that for the most part, we'll be talking about truth makers irrespective of whether they do or don't obtain. We'll be looking at the issue of what are the truth makers for a sentence sort of in toto, including the ones that might have obtained but didn't, which is probably perhaps slightly a misuse. So we'll reserve a word like actual truth maker for the ones that do obtain. But the third is that a truth maker should be wholly relevant to us, with nothing extra thrown in. And this is a notion that Armstrong, in his old work on metaphysical truth makers, this is more semantic truth makers, he used a term which maybe doesn't quite mean the same thing, but he said we want discerning truth makers that are focused on this sentence, but not on random other sentences. So you could have the way the world is in toto could be conceived as a truth maker for all true sentences, but we're usually interested in something more dedicated to the particular sentence involved. How dedicated is a sort of a separate and interesting question. I've sometimes used the word proportional truth makers. Kit Fine much more influentially has spoken of exact truth makers, and I'll probably go back and forth between those. And there's been a little bit of work on this lately about whether exact truth makers are more fundamental or inexact truth makers. And I gather that I just noticed that Hannes Leitgeb has a paper on this, on trying to treat inexact truth makers as more fundamental. But this sort of talk about what's the most fundamental notion and the most perspicuous account is sort of more at home in metaphysical context than in the present semantic context. I mean, mostly semantic context. What's the problem? Okay. All right. So let's talk about sufficiency. There's a slight tension between the first two conditions that I put down, sufficiency and explanatoriness. So, and I can sort of identify the tension kind of analogically by looking at how it arises in causal settings. Because sometimes what feels to us intuitively like the cause of an effect really is not sufficient, because all by itself it might actually work against the effect, but it's there as a counter to another thing that all by itself would have worked against the effect. And so here's an example. So let's suppose the following could happen. that you're alive on a certain occasion because you took warfarin, which is rat poison. I don't know whether you've ever had this experience, but people, when they go to the hospital in the States, sometimes find when they look at the list of what they've been given that there's this drug that's actually identical to rat poison. And what it is it's a blood thinner, and you give rats enough of it, and their blood becomes so thin that they die. But if you've got a blood clot, if you've had a stroke, or for various reasons, you might need to have your blood thin very, very quickly. And then they give you rat poison. Well, of course, unsurprisingly, rat poison doesn't suffice for aliveness. You can't in general think, I'm worried I might die, let's take some rat poison. It actually could kill you unless you have blood clots connected maybe with a stroke. But what might be, so then the warfarin sort of expends itself on the blood clots, and so it doesn't hurt you, it just helps you. And that's how I'm imagining it anyway. You could just think more generally of a case where the antidote to a poison is itself poisonous unless it has the original poison to sort of work against. Okay, so what may be sufficient for aliveness, even this is a stretch, is the explainer, the warfarin, and that's the thing that explains why you're still alive, plus the fact that makes it explanatory, the blood clots. It's because of the blood clots that the warfarin helped to make you, or to help you stay alive. So we can distinguish between, say, an explainer or a cause and a thing and the fact that makes it explanatory, or the cause maker, the thing that makes it a cause. I mean, another example might be in the kind of famously, like you wish you thought of a different example, sort of two-shooter case. Maybe two assassins were both going to shoot the victim. The first bullet would have arrived first, and been responsible for the death, but something deflects it. And that's what confers causal status on the second bullet. So it's not like the second bullet all by itself is so relevant. It's only, is the thing that you'd look at as the cause, but it's in the context of something having stopped the first bullet that it suddenly leaps to the fore. Okay. Now here's an example. It's a bit strained. Let me confess that I can point you to where there's better examples, but I could get this one up there quickly, where something similar perhaps happens with truth makers. So take the sentence: all snowflakes are unique. I don't know if that's a thing that people say, but at least school children are, if not taught, led to believe that every snowflake is incomparable over here. And why is that true? Well, you might think it's true because, well, here's all the different snowflakes, flake 1, flake 0, flake 1, flake 2. It's because each of them is unique that all snowflakes are unique. And indeed, if those are all the snowflakes, then it's because each of those is sort of non-isomorphic with all of the others, that all snowflakes are unique. But since the truth maker that I am indicating here, I might have not clarified this enough, doesn't include that these are snowflakes, and certainly not that these are all the snowflakes. The fact that F0, F1, F2, ... are unique doesn't suffice for the truth of all snowflakes are unique. In fact, something needs to be said to sort of bring it into any kind of relevance relation to that sentence, because we don't even know yet that they're snowflakes. But a more serious worry is, look, that these things are all, let's suppose they are snowflakes, unique, might just be a sign that you haven't got all the snowflakes. You've only limited yourself to the unique snowflakes. So you'd need to have some, well, we'll come to what else you need in a sec. You might even think that the uniqueness of each of these snowflakes could work against the sentence's truth on the theory that, well, it's really hard to be unique. Not, when something is totally unique, that's sort of a special moment in the history of the universe. Not much is unique. So the fact that these are unique is perhaps, you could conceive it as sort of evidence that they're not all the snowflakes. I said it was a lame example. What may be sufficient is the explainer. These particular flakes are unique, plus the reason, the reason that it's explanatory, they're the snowflakes. I had an earlier example. All pearls are special. That's why it says they're the pearls, but same basic idea. So let's assume for now, even though I'm a bit worried about this because of the explanatory angle, let's say for now that us as truth makers do necessitate its truth, but believe our minds open to the possibility that maybe they only necessitate the truth together with their truth maker makers, the facts that sort of bring the truth makers into coordination with the sentences they make true. Okay. All right, so let's talk about relevance, which is by far the hardest to explain, and we're going to come up short as well. An extremely common story due to J.L. Mackey in his old paper on causes and Inus conditions. I think it might have been called Causes and Conditions. Goes roughly as follows. I'm using my own terminology, and he initially aimed at this at causal relevance, well, at causation, which he identified with being causally relevant to. So this is supposed to correspond to, if you've encountered that idea, the notion of being an Inus condition for some effect. So the first definition here is, and think of X and Y as like conditions on the world. They could even be sentences. X is proportional to Y, and I use the sort of physicist symbol for proportionality. X, so it's not an alpha, it's a proportionality symbol. X is proportional to Y if and only if first X suffices for Y, X guarantees Y, maybe along with whatever it is that, whatever the truth maker is, or the cause maker is, but I'll leave that aside. And here's like the magic ingredient, nothing less suffices. It's a least sufficer. This is probably the standard way of getting at relevance. The thing that's minimally sufficient seems like it would be, could not contain anything irrelevant, because the irrelevant thing could be dropped and you'd have an even smaller sufficient thing. We'll see that that is wrong, and that's mostly what this whole discussion today is going to be about. But it's certainly a very, very attractive idea, and there's many areas in philosophy and in math where people try to get at the thing that's really doing the damage, so to speak, by looking for a minimal thing of a certain size. Also in artificial intelligence, people use minimal models in this sense to sort of explain sort of how cognition works a lot of the time. Just fix enough of the world to ensure that this sentence will be true. Situation semantics also involves these sorts of considerations, and I'll give an example from situation semantics in a second. Second, so what is it for Z to be relevant? Well, basically something is relevant if it extends to a condition that's proportional to Y. So a stronger condition than Z is proportional to Y. Pretty big problems. So in other words, suppose it's the case that by lighting the match in an oxygenated room, containing, say, very dry newspaper, is proportional to the newspaper catching fire, or maybe not lighting it in exactly the right place. Any part of that, like my lighting the match, will count as relevant, because you can extend it to an actually obtaining condition that's proportional to Y. By being proportional, that means it's got nothing irrelevant in it. So the original thing, Z, because it's sort of in Z plus, and Z plus contains nothing irrelevant, is going to count as relevant for that. for that reason. So this is in slightly different language, but the basic idea should be pretty familiar. It's the idea of, as Mackey says, an insufficient, well, Mackey's thing involves more, but it's related to what Mackey calls an insufficient necessary part of an unnecessary sufficient condition. By an insufficient necessary part, he means an insufficient non-redundant part. In other words, if you took it away, you'd get a condition that wasn't sufficient any longer. And this is just a play on that. 3 problems. Biggest one, which is mentioned every now and then, going back a long time, least sufficers may not exist. It's not every effect that has a least sufficient, causally sufficient condition for it. It's not every truth that has a minimally sufficient basis for its truth. Second problem, and this is related to something we talked about last time, it looks as though it makes relevance intentional, whereas really relevance is not intentional. It's hyper-intentional. It depends on relevance of x to y can change if you replace x with an x prime that's necessarily equivalent to, relevance or proportionality can change if you replace x with an x prime that's necessarily equivalent to x, but puts its demands on different parts of the world, as we said last time. Okay, I just saw that I went, hold on, let me see if I can. Did my image go stop and just start again for you? No? Okay, that's really important because I'm really concerned about my image. It's flagging. Okay, least sufficers. So this is, I find this completely fascinating because you got this established methodology. You get relevance by shrinking down to minimal sufficers. And that's what people use all the time, but it doesn't work. And no one has looked very hard. Kid Fine is very clear that it doesn't work. Many people are clear that it doesn't work, but they just ignore the fact that it doesn't work. And I don't know how to provide an alternative analysis, but I do know how to sort of wring my hands about the problem at great length, and I'll suggest a way of thinking of the issue. Yeah, so here's Kratzer's example from an investigation into the lumps of thought. Oh, so by the way, somebody was asking last time, where did that quote come from about blah blah blah? It's even partly true. Not that it's wholly true. People always expect that something will be wholly true, but it isn't. Okay, it's from J.D. Salinger, who's a writer that just about every American high school student reads. He wrote the classic sort of coming-of-age juvenile delinquent novel called Catcher in the Rye. And the thing that was partly true is you don't act your age. And he said that is partly true, but it's also partly false. Sometimes I act older than my age. And so this is part of his frustration with the adult world generally, is that it oversimplifies. And life is sort of much more textured than you think. Okay, so there are infinitely many stars. And Kratzer points out, she's just given a definition of what it is for a situation to exemplify a truth that has some flavor of minimality in it. It's a very interesting definition, which I'm not giving here. But then she says, there are infinitely many stars. If this is true, oh, I should say, by the way, that Greg Restall gave an example just like this to Armstrong that appeared in one of his early Truthmaker books. There are infinitely many electrons. And actually, Greg and I we're talking not that long ago about how to bring this to bear on some certain issues in infinitary logic. But okay, here's what she says. There are infinitely many stars. If this is true in any possible situation in which there are infinitely many stars, that would seem to be the kind of situation we'd be looking for. We're in trouble. The definition would predict that there couldn't be a fact that makes it true. Why? Because the definition basically says, this it's actually much subtler than this, but it says, a situation exemplifies, or a fact exemplifies. Well, it says, she uses the word makes true, so that I should just stick with that. A fact makes a sentence true, just in case nothing less makes it true. What she really says is, everything in it is justified by reference to a part of the original fact to which it's essential. You lose the truth-making aspect of that part. So what she's really interested in, I find this fascinating too, is she wants to say, there are teapots. That's exemplified by a situation with 3 teapots. Now, that's not a minimal sufficer for the truth of there are teapots, but nevertheless, everything in it is justified by its necessity to a sub-situation of the original situation, etc. Anyway, but this still doesn't help with this problem. So pick any infinite bunch of stars that you like and toss one out. You've still got a truth sufficer, so the first truth maker was not minimal, and that's the first problem. Hyperintentionality. Well, we've defined relevance more or less in terms of sufficiency, an intentional notion. This is really a lie, because if you look at the actual definition of relevance, it contains this part about the relation between z and z plus, and I haven't really made clear whether that relation is the intentional notion of being weaker than, or the hyper-intentional notion of being part of. Really, it should be the second, but that's an argument we gave last time, but we'll just sort of imagine ourselves naive on this point. So is relevance an intentional notion? So here's an example that I'm somewhat overly in love with that shows that it isn't. So there's a famous hymn that you may know or have heard, Amazing Grace. Yeah, of course, you probably, here I go, blank again. Hold on a sec. So Amazing Grace is got a lot of verses, and here's one that's rarely, people rarely get to it. And here's what it says. When we've been here 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun, we've no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. It's a very interesting observation. It's actually very similar to, now I've forgotten, whose definition of infinity?
Dedekind.
Dedekind, sorry, thank you. Dedekind, thank you very much. So the guy, no, I've forgotten his name too, but the guy who wrote this hymn, who's also a fascinating guy, he anticipated Dedekind by probably about 100 years. This was well, actually, this was written in the 1760s, I think. But he's really, so Dedekind defines an infinite set as one that's equal in number to one of its proper subsets. There's a bijection between a set and one of its proper subsets that makes the set infinite. And it's essentially what our hymn author is saying here. What, to add to the, not that it's terribly wonderful historical irony here, this is, what we're working up here is Hume himself gives a minimal sufficient condition analysis of causation in the Enquiry. The Enquiry was published, I believe, in 1741 in Scotland. The guy who wrote this hymn was at pretty much that very moment on a slave ship returning from Africa that almost went down off the coast of Ireland. And he got religion when this happened. He was a terrible guy. And then he got religion when this happened. And then a few years later, he wrote this hymn. So Hume's definition of causation was being refuted, or at least the grounds for its refutation were being. John Newton, thank you. John Newton, Sally found out, were being laid at the very moment that it was being published. Okay, so let Y be, and here, this is more on the truth maker side. We're not talking about causation. I'll mention a causal example toward the end. So Y is his praise is sung infinitely many days. So that's a statement that it seems like it could be true for lots of different reasons. There's lots of choices of infinitely many days. So we assume that the future is infinite, of course, and that there's that many days to come. Let Y star be, well, John Newton says, we've no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun if we wait 10,000 years. So why don't we let Y star be? His praise is sung infinitely many days after November 27th, 12,020, 10,000 years from now. And then let X be, this is the proposed truth maker, his praise is sung every day starting today. Now here's the thing to realize, Y and Y star are necessarily equivalent. I mean, modulo certain assumptions, but pretty weak assumptions. So his praise can't be sung infinitely many days if it's only sung finitely many days after November 27th, 12,020, because adding 10,000 years of days isn't going to make the difference between infinitely many and not infinitely many. The real work, the real heavy lifting is going to have to be done after, pick any date that you like. The infinity is going to have to happen in an infinite chain of days from that point on. Now X, I take it, is pretty clearly, so yeah, so it would be a counterexample to intentionality of relevance if X was wholly relevant to one of Y and Y star, but not the other. And that's the case. X is wholly relevant to Y, but it's overkill when it comes to Y star. The fact that his praise is sung every day, starting today, doesn't seem like it's wholly relevant to whether his praise is sung infinitely many days after some date in 12,020. It doesn't matter whether the first 10,000 years of praise singing make no difference to the truth of Y star. They do make I shouldn't say make a difference. They do seem wholly relevant to the truth of Y, but it's not because Y and Y star are true in different worlds. It's because, as I put it last time, Y and Y star put their demands on different parts of the world, even though those demands are equisatisfiable. I mean, they're necessarily co-satisfied. Nevertheless, they're put on different parts of the world. And you get irrelevance sometimes because, in this case, X puts demands on a part of a world that Y star completely ignores. X really worries itself. What's happening over here in this part of the world? When, in fact, it's clear if you look at Y star that it couldn't care less what happens in that part of the world. Okay. And indeed, there's no finite part of the world that you could point to and say, well, Y star really cares what happens here. The real action is always elsewhere for a statement of this kind. Okay, so that's the second problem, hyperintentionality. And now the third problem. So the claim was, and this one we actually saw last time, the claim was that X is proportional to Y, which is a kind of relevance. It's relevance plus sufficiency, if nothing less suffices. But this asks too much if a weaker condition, or a would-be weaker condition, the kind of condition that would knock X out of proportion with Y, that the weakness of that weaker condition just is sort of asymmetric necessitation. So remember that example of Socrates and drinking or falling? It was his drinking the hemlock that caused his death. But why wasn't that knocked out of proportion with Socrates' death by the weaker condition of his drinking hemlock or falling off a cliff? And the reason was, well, we don't just want a weaker condition, we want a condition that's part of the original condition, and drinking or falling is not part of drinking. So what we meant, or should have meant, and started talking about this before, is that none of X's proper parts suffice for Y. And this fits with the hyperintentionality issue, because content part is a hyperintentional notion. Necessary equivalents, true in different ways, are going to differ mereologically. So A holds in the same worlds as A or A and B. But if you follow the definition of part we gave, at least on a certain way of assigning truth makers, A or B is part of A or A and B, but it's not part of A, even though those two things on the right-hand side are necessarily equivalent. Okay, so how to explain truth ways if not via minimality? Well, there's explaining, and here's where I start. Here's where the apologetics start. There's explaining in the sense of analyzing in genuinely independent terms, and there's explaining in the sense of saying, look, I can't really explain this. The notion is primitive in my system, but I can sort of give you an idea of what I mean. True ways, truth makers, will be taken as primitive here. Something does have to be said, though, about which primitive is intended and why we would expect true ways understood in the intended manner to be wholly relevant to their to the truths that they bear on. This sounds opportunistic and irresponsible, which is a charge that usually can fairly be leveled against me. But in this case, I realized fairly late in the day that it's really just something that Lewis does, and Lewis by definition is never opportunistic and irresponsible. I'm just doing the same thing. So we're interested in the question, way omega for a sentence P to hold. The corresponding notion, the one that we kind of tried to rain on that parade last time, is world W where P holds. How does Lewis define world W where a sentence P holds? He doesn't define it. He never defines it. He just makes the problem go away by dividing it into two parts. First part is, what is the set of worlds proposition, script P, expressed by the sentence P? Well, he says, oh, well, that's a problem for metasemantics. I shouldn't say that he does say a lot about it. This is the business about reference magnets and, causal correlation and all the rest. So he does have something to be said about which set of worlds proposition is expressed by a sentence, but not when he's doing possible world semantics. That's the job for somebody else. This is metasemantics, not semantics. The other question that world W where P holds requires an answer to is, when is that proposition P true in a world W? So that's trivial. Proposition is a set of worlds, right? It's true in a world if the world is a member of the set. Well, we're going to do exactly the same thing. How do we define, well, except not doing the hard part, which Lewis does do. How do we define way omega for sentence P to hold? We don't. We instead follow Lewis in dividing the problem into two parts. What is the set of ways proposition, blackboard P, expressed by the sentence P? And this is set aside as a problem for metasemantics. When is that proposition, blackboard P, made true by omega? Trivial. The proposition is verified by omega if and only if omega is a member of the proposition. It's a set of its truth makers. That's what propositions are going to be, as we discussed last time. Let me say in addition that, the sort of classic text where someone argues that, look, a set of propositions are really all we're entitled to and all we should want, something that coarse grain is really the proper notion, is Stolniker's book Inquiry, where he says, look, there's no naturalized metasemantics that cares about hyper-intentional distinctions, because we're always just looking at kind of causal correlations between states of the world and mental states. I guess one thing we could ask ourselves is, well, if you looked at teleosemantics, would hyper-intentional stuff get in? Very likely. But also, naturalized correlational semantics, oftentimes, Stolniker sort of isn't very explicit on this, makes use of counterfactuals. And counterfactuals are very likely hyper-intentional. There's a difference between, if I say, if I had, if maybe I have a headache, if I had an aspirin, I'd feel better. If I had an aspirin and poison, or an aspirin and not poison, I would feel better. Most people would classify the second one as false. But of course, having an aspirin is necessarily equivalent to having an aspirin with poison or with not poison. So to the extent that counterfactuals are figuring in your naturalized metasemantics and counterfactuals are hyper-intentional, who's to say that you can't, that what you're really identifying by applying the proper conditions, whatever they are, is ways for the world to be as opposed to worlds. But that's just a throwaway idea. So which kinds of ways do we have in mind? And this is the hard part. And what I'm going to say is profoundly unsatisfying, although it might sort of introduce you to a bunch of issues that are well worth thinking about. So ways, as I mentioned last time, are, you can think of them as sort of brought into existence to play a certain role. They're the answers to how questions, just as I think I might have said, amounts are the answers to how much questions, and cardinalities are the answers to how many questions. And for Frege, truth values are the answers to binary or polar, is it the case that P questions. That's what they are for Frege. Okay, so here are, but there's all kinds of hows. Hows range very, very widely. And indeed, I mean, the ones that are probably most famous are hows of means and manners, like sort of, how did you build your house? Well, first I made enough money to buy the materials for a house, and then I bought the materials, and then blah, blah, blah. Then there's manner, which is different, which doesn't include sort of prior stuff that was sort of a causal precondition, but has to do just with, well, how you carry it out. It's the kind of thing that would often be expressed with adverbial modification or prepositional modification. This is what I found quite fascinating to think about, to show just how widely these range, is there's hows of assessment. So how did you sleep? And you don't say, you might say in some cases, by using a certain app that helps me to relax. Might be a how of means. It wouldn't be a how of manner. But probably you'd say, badly. I slept badly, or I slept well, or whatever. That's a how of assessment, or how did she sing? Beautifully. Okay, this clearly has nothing to do with how it came about that she sang. Maybe, you could find in Aristotle some theory to the effect that certain things happen because they're drawn to happening beautifully, or happening in some value-laden way. But for the most part, that's not how we think of it. So here are some paradigms and foils of the sort of ways that we have in mind. And you could really go on and on and on thinking of examples, and I confess that I'm only scratching the surface here. So here are some paradigms of what should be a way, if truth makers are ways for the relevant sentence to be true. Sorry, just give me one second. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, yeah. All right. So to sing should be a way to sing or dance. So I'm talking more broadly about ways. Our real interest ultimately is ways for something to be true. But we're going to speak broadly about ways for something to be the case, or something to happen, or to do something. And most of the discussion, actually, I should say, in literature is in action theory. And the question is, what is a way of doing something? And there's a great lot of discussion going back to Anscombe, maybe also Wittgenstein, on the bilocution. I did this by doing that. We'll come to that in a sec. So to sing is a way to sing or dance. That I sung, looking ahead, is a way for it to be true that I sang or danced. For me to sing is a way for someone to sing. To yodel is a way of singing. I was going to say, Yodel, that's something that Hank Williams does. But of course, they do it in Switzerland too. So you're probably closer to Switzerland than Hank Williams. So I'll leave it there. For everyone to yodel is a way for everyone to sing. Those are all ways of the intended sort, and you can see that there would be associated truth-maker claims that would sort of fit these models. Now here's some foils. These are things that are not a way of singing. So to sing and dance, or to sing while dancing, is not a way to sing. That might be true for, I don't know, maybe there are contexts where that could be true on another reading of way, but it's a bit of a stretch. For everyone to sing is not a way for me to sing. How did you sing? Everyone sang. Maybe Humean explanations of events kind of fit this pattern, treating this foil as though it was a how of means. Sort of, how did this come about? Or how did this happen? This always happens, is a so-called Humean explanation. To sing badly is not a way of singing in the relevant sense. You wouldn't sort of offer as a truth maker for someone singing the claim that they sang that, well, they sang very badly. In fact, you wouldn't probably want to use the word sing at all in the truth maker unless it was a basic sort of claim that didn't have a sort of informative, so to speak, truth maker. There's this justly forgotten joke where from the New Yorkers used to tell, like, the tourist is in town, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? They want to see Carnegie Hall. And the answer is practice, right? That's how you get to Carnegie Hall, because thinking that the person wants to get there as a performer. So that again is not going to count as a way of getting to Carnegie Hall. And certainly if someone did get to Carnegie Hall, the truth maker for that wouldn't be that they practiced. Okay, so now here's a rough 4-part test to knock out the foils. So I want to say, I call it the only in part by test because it targets these 4 words, only, in, part, and by, not in that order. So psiing is a way of phying only if a thing phies by psiing. Of course, this is kind of not exactly stipulative, but I'm really trying to focus on a particular understanding of way, the kind that's relevant to truth maker theory. So a thing phies by psiing. A thing phies in psiing. Another place where these kinds of locutions came in for heavy and ultimately unsatisfactory uses in the early days of speech act theory, where people tried to say, distinguish perlocutionary from illocutionary from locutionary acts by clever use of these prepositions. Like the locutionary act is what you do in uttering the sentence. The illocutionary act, like assertion, is done, well, now I'm actually how it actually goes, but since it didn't work, it doesn't matter. The third one is a bit trickier. It goes back to a famous passage in Kratzer. You don't count as, suppose that someone says they only phied. The question is saying, is this one could by saying, no, you also psied. And the answer is, that objection does not work if psiing is a way of phying. But it might work if psiing isn't a way of phying. And then finally, we consider the negation. And this is a bit related to the stuff last time about parts and wholes. I'm kind of reversing the relation between ways and parts. Consider what it is to not psi. Is not phying part of not psiing? I want to say, if to phi is a way of psiing, then when you kind of the parts of failing to psi, One of them will be, well, you better not have, well, you didn't, phi. Okay, there goes my, so. All right, so let me go through the rules. Why is it that to sing and dance is not a way of singing? Thumbs down on that suggestion. Well, you could use the by test. I don't say by singing and dancing. The by should tell you should play some explanatory role in kind of telling you how it came about that I sang. But if it already includes that I sang, then by isn't appropriate. And also, if I sing or dance, then I don't only sing. If someone says, I guess I never actually gave you the passage from Kratzer where she introduces this only thing, but she says, look, yeah, I mentioned it last time very briefly, I think, about the dialogue with the lunatic and the dialogue with the pedant. So I'll just treat this as something you can pick up on the fly. Someone says, I only sang this afternoon. So that's not true. You also sang and danced, or you also danced. Okay. Why is it that we don't want to say that for everyone to sing is a way for me to sing? Well, think of everyone singing as, this is the way I sometimes like to think of it, that truth making is something done by the world. The world makes the sentence true by being a certain way. So imagine the world is trying to make it true that I sing. It couldn't say to itself, here's a bright idea, I'll get everyone to sing, and then he'll have had to sing. You can't arrange for me to sing by having everyone sing, because on the contrary, part of what it is for everyone to sing is for me to sing. And the rest of it is irrelevant. To sing badly, is that a way of singing? Well, no, I don't sing by singing badly. And if you ask for what are the parts of not singing, not singing badly isn't intuitively, I admit intuitions don't take us too far here, a part of not singing is to practice a way of getting to Carnegie Hall. Well, no, I don't arrive at Carnegie Hall in practicing, and not to arrive there isn't in part not to practice. Whereas if you look at the other examples that I mentioned, they do seem to pass this test. So for me to sing is a way for someone to sing. The world could arrange for someone to sing by having me sing. I do sing by yodeling. Not yodeling is part of not, at least it's not insane to think so. Okay. So here's the thought. Omega is a way for P to hold. Now I'm back to truth makers. If a world verifies I being W, by being that way, by being omega, sorry, a world verifies P in being omega, it's not the case that if someone says, oh, it's only the case, sorry, the world only verifies P, you can't correct that by saying, it's also omega. It did more than verify P, it's also omega. So you can't say that, for instance. Suppose I say, this is, of course, insane thing to say, but suppose I say, well, the world only verified Yablo sang. Well, for the world to be such that Yablo yodeled doesn't really correct that, because the world had to do something to verify that I sang, and so I have to sing in some particular way. There's no such thing as generically, I guess there's tunelessly humming, but there's no such thing as generically singing. Whereas most ways the world do correct the claim that the world only verified Yablo sang. And again, for a world not to be omega is part of it's not verifying P. If a world doesn't verify, he's saying, part of that is that it better not involve my yodeling. Okay. Actually, suppose that omega harbors irrelevancies, or for in some very broad sense, there's a good chance that it won't satisfy these tests. So why does the world? So why do we want to not say that the world's containing stars and planets is how it verifies there are stars? Well, it doesn't verify there are stars by containing stars and planets, because the planets were irrelevant. It also doesn't verify there are stars in containing, say, star precursors. Maybe certain gases, if there's enough of them, are bound to turn into stars by the action of gravity. And it could be the case that the world does there are stars by containing star precursors, because they're what causally leads to stars, and which then verify there are stars. It doesn't verify there are stars in containing star precursors, and then only in part are a bit harder to run intuitively, but I think they go in the same direction. All right. So how does this test get around minimality? Oh, doing here for time. 11:53. So I'm almost done. Yeah. So the test, even if omega is a non-minimal way for it to be true. So our example was there are infinitely many stars. Let the sentence S be there are infinitely many stars. And so let's just pick some random bunch of infinitely many stars, S naught, S1, S2. W does, I'm just gonna here's the by test and the in test and the part test. Containing these particular infinitely many stars, it does seem to be by containing them that W verifies S. But then suppose I throw in Mars. If you use minimality, Mars is no worse than the stars. Because you want to object, look, Mars isn't relevant to the world containing infinitely many stars, because you could get rid of Mars and you still have a truth maker. But the problem is that one of the stars and you still have a truth maker too, because there's still infinitely many left. That's really the problem we're confronting. Whereas if the by test does seem to work against adding Mars in. The world doesn't verify there are infinitely many by containing these infinitely many stars and Mars. W does not which I'm not saying is sort of a deep analysis in other terms. It's just a test, a way of making sure we're all on the same page. So W, again, apply the in test. Suppose I said, oh, here's a way that the world contains infinitely many stars. It contains these infinitely many and Mars. But containing them, it doesn't contain infinitely many. Sorry, I think sorry, this is really the only test. If I say, the world only verifies there are infinitely many stars. It's not true, but the question is, what can you say by way of correcting that? Saying it contains Mars and those stars does seem to counterexample the claim that it only verifies that statement. But to mention just the stars doesn't counterexample that claim. And then there's a similar example for the part test. Okay, so relevance more generally, and then I'm just about done. I spoke, or at least I mentioned briefly, that we're also interested potentially in failures of minimality as a device for getting at what's wholly relevant when we're talking about the relevance appropriate to causality or morality. So it's like you might say, well, what's the reason this is a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? And you want to mention what are the good or right making aspects of the action. You don't want to mention stuff that isn't a good or right making aspect. You want to mention only stuff that's relevant to its having that moral status. So let big arrow superscript alpha stand schematically for any old kind of sufficiency, causal, rational, whatever. And these could be understood in various ways, and it's not going to be important. So I'm just going to give some definitions. So Y is guaranteed, superscript alpha, if and only if something suffices in the alpha mode for Y. X proportional, superscript alpha, to Y, if and only if X suffices in the alpha way for Y, is a way for it to be true that Y is guaranteed. Z is relevant, super alpha, is part of some X that's alpha proportional to Y. So that's the example, and I'll just get, that's the definition, and I'll just give this one example that's kind of like the God example, and then we'll be done. The infinitely many praise days example. So let's suppose that it pleases God to be praised infinitely many days. And try not to worry yourself too much about when God realizes that he's been praised infinitely many days. Let's just suppose he's, I don't know, maybe he needs to be sempiternal, or there's some kind of way God can be in time so that he can appreciate that he's been praised or going to be praised infinitely many days. It's middle knowledge or something. So say it pleases God to be praised infinitely many days. Why is praising God today causally relevant to God's pleasure when God would still have been pleased if we'd waited 10,000 years before beginning? Well, first, praising God is causally proportional in the sense given to it just above, is causally proportional to the pleasure. I want to say, why? Well, to be causally proportional to the pleasure is to be a way for God's pleasure causally guaranteed to hold. So one way in which it's the case that God's pleasure is causally guaranteed to hold is that praising God every day causally guarantees God's pleasure. To see an analog of, what happens if you put Mars in or something irrelevant. Suppose I had said, certainly praising God every day starting tomorrow, that's also causally proportional to the pleasure. All its parts are relevant. But what if I said cursing God today and praising God thereafter? We don't want this to be proportional, because then cursing God will turn out to be relevant to God's pleasure. God doesn't like being cursed. So why is cursing God today and praising God thereafter not a way for God's pleasure is causally guaranteed to hold? Well, you can see why by looking at the tests. I mean, if someone says, did the world only verify God's pleasure is guaranteed? A proper answer would be no. It also had us curse God one day. So that's going beyond what it needed to do to verify God's pleasure is guaranteed. Of course, arranging for us to praise God every day also goes beyond, but not in a way that makes it appropriate to say, well, the world didn't only verify God's pleasure is causally guaranteed, because you can't really say, no, that it had us praise God today. So yeah, but you can't really object too much to that, because then you'd have to object to all the days of God praising, and then you'd have nothing left. All right. So summing up, true ways are supposed to be sufficient, explanatory, and wholly relevant. The first two, slightly at odds with one another once we distinguish explainers. from what makes them explainers. I didn't really go into that. I just wanted to sort of plant a seed in your mind. The real problem is making sense of relevance. Minimal sufficiency just asks too much. Main reason being there often isn't a minimal sufficient condition. Treating way for a sentence to hold or to be true as primitive is really not much worse than treating world where the sentence holds as primitive. The only in part by test helps us home in on the intended primitive without minimality. And that's, whoops, the end. Thanks. Whoops, that's next time.